Okay. So hello again. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's SimSip technical webinar. My name is Xian Pan. I'm from Translational DMPK group at SimSip Certara, and I will be your host today. Can you move to the next slide, please, for me? Great. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, my colleague, Dr. Matthew Howard. Dr. Matthew Howard is a principal scientist at Translational DMPK Group at SimSip Certara. He joined the SimSip since 2007 and possesses a keen interest in transporter and metabolism. He has led multiple wishlist projects, including the redevelopment of reverse translational tool in 2018. And today, Dr. Howard will talk about the reverse translational tool. He will show the key features like available populations, the retrograde option, and the iterative option. During the presentation, you have any query, please do not hesitate to post them in the chat box or signal by raise your hand. There will be a Q&A segment at the end of the session, and we'll address all your questions. I'm sure this will be an informative and engaging talk. Without further ado, I will hand over the stage to Matt. The floor is yours, Matt.
Thanks very much, Jan. Okay, so I'm going to migrate between PowerPoint, the simulator, and also some Excel. So there'll be a bit of moving around of platforms. But let's start off on a bit of background and basic theory. So for approximately 15 years or more, a retrograde approach has been available to enable the recovery of enzyme-specific FMs and to recover clinically derived clearance data. And it does this by returning appropriate intrinsic clearances for given assigned isoforms that are available in the simulator. Quite simply, the retrograde approach that was available for many years is based on the reversal of the mathematical operations applied in a typical IV-IVE simulation, focusing on reversing the well-stirred liver model that we typically utilize and the metabolic IV-IVE for the SIPs using a recombinant approach, where we will factor in liver weight, microsomal protein, CYP450 abundances, to name but a few parameters. And therefore, the tool is capable of returning the CYP activity as an intrinsic clearance per picomole of CYP450, which can then be applied back into the simulator to return the FMs and the clearance assigned through the forward scaling IV-IVE as best it can. In version 18, a significant update to the reverse translational tool, or the RTT, was undertaken, where amongst many features that were added in was the capacity to return the UGT isoform activities as well as the CYPs. And this was done via a forward scaling iterative method. So if you want to go and review in great detail the reverse translational tool and all the components to it and some of the philosophies behind it, then you can revisit the V18 W5 release webinar. Please go to our members area if you're a consortium member or affiliate, and you can request the appropriate release webinar to view as a video. So the RTT operates with the relevant system parameters employed for the specific populations in the simulator to ensure the best possible or most applicable outcomes in the IV-IVE forward scaling. It's important to note that the RTT is a fairly pragmatic tool, and it works with the steady state algebraic approaches in the simulator, which are in line with the PK/PD parameters mode and not time-based differential equation approaches. So at this moment here, I'm going to migrate off and I'm going to go to the simulator. So hopefully you can view the simulator. I'm sure many people that are familiar with the simulator have utilized the reverse translational tools. It's a very well used feature. It can be found in the Enzyme Kinetics part of the elimination screen. And you have to have the recombinant radio button selected. And then you click on the calculator. So this is under the SIPs tab. So if we open this up, this wizard pops up and we get the reverse translational tools functional interface. We have the option to select the retrograde, which I'll focus on in the first part, and then I'll focus a little bit on the iterative. So first of all, we have our populations. We have 6 available, so you can see those in the drop down. 5 are healthy adult populations, while there is also 1 cancer population. These are SIM populations, so the SIM prefix here, and these are verified internally by SimSip and comprise part of our library files, as I'm sure you're aware. We have focused on the healthy adult populations due to the best practice approaches that should be adopted within PBPK, where typically we are looking to develop and verify our models in healthy adults and apply our models to other scenarios, for example, diseases or age-impacted populations such as pediatrics. So it makes sense to focus on these and foster this approach. Likewise, the restriction for SIM prefix population files curated within our team is due to the best practice, so we're kind of exerting an internal quality control to utilize these. So essentially that improves we believe that will improve the development and traceability to benefit the user. And you can hear a little bit more about the philosophy behind this in the version 18 release webinar for this project. One thing to note is that although these SIM populations, you can't essentially alter the parameters and resave the population under the SIM name. What you can do though is you can adapt parameters in the underlying population, for example, enzyme abundances or blood flow to the liver, and then that can feed in and affect your outcomes here. But you need to make sure that when you run the IVIVE through, once you've got your solutions in the RTT, that you then apply the same physiological changes through the IVIVE, otherwise you'll get a disconnect. Okay, so obviously we have the healthy volunteers. We want the cancer population as our sole non-healthy population. But one thing to bear in mind with a cancer population is it may be impacted on by disease. So, for example, hematocrit can affect the BP, and so the BP that's typically given on your PhysChem screen is that for the healthy. In the cancer population, if you're running it through the IVIVE, then hematocrit may well impact on BP. So that's one thing to be considering, and that can slightly affect your overall IVIVE outcomes. So you can view the drug population parameters output sheet to see how BP is affected. Okay, so moving on to defining the age and gender or sex distribution of the clinical trial population. So if you want to run it in the SIM healthy volunteers, then you just make that selection. That's in line with your clinical trial data. You add in the age range of that trial, which you want to add the clearance values, for example, to. So if it was running 18 to 30-year-olds, males, then you would have changed these values applicable to match the clinical trial data. Just moving further down here, we have the Vivo Clearance options here. So CLiv is the in vivo IV clearance, obviously. These can be drawn automatically from the simulator. So if you have an entry for CLiv or likewise CLpo in the in vivo clearance part of the elimination screen, then these are drawn in directly. If you don't, then you can just add them in as a user input. So we've got alprazolam, for example, open here, and this already has these values populated within the elimination screen. One thing to just confirm is that the input values are expected to be derived from plasma, as in the code. Once we click to predict through the reverse translational tool, these will be converted back to blood, as the requirements of the well-stirred liver model require it to be running through blood. So conversion via BP is done in the background. Likewise, the same for the renal clearance, for example. Focus a little bit on the CLpo afterwards, but just to note another value that comes from screen input. So FA is actually coming from the absorption screen with the user input FA. So if you adjust that on the absorption screen, it should then translate through to this value here. We don't have such an example for FG, so you have to add that in yourself. So the renal clearance will pass through from the elimination screen. You can also alter other parameters. So if you've got biliary clearance, then this can be added as a percentage of your CLiv. So this is only available if you have the CLiv option on. If there's any other additional clearance, then this can be added into, can come from the elimination screen equivalent parameter, or you can add it in. And essentially the CLR, CLadd, and the biliary clearance can be stripped off the CLiv to obtain the a better handle of the hepatic metabolic clearance, which is the sole aim of the CLiv approach for the retrograde. If we move down here to the drug parameters, then these are typically taken from the library screen. So the FU, the BP, that's taken from the PhysChem screen. The AHS net, so an uptake or an efflux factor on the sinusoidal membrane, that comes from the elimination screen. The FU gut is actually fixed to 1, and that can be calculated through if you do have a CLpo option on, but it starts at a value of 1 and can be drawn down if required, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. The Q gut can be set as padlocked, where if you've got an FA running through the system from the CLpo, it will back calculate a Q gut value through the relevant system parameters. I'll talk about that in a minute. Or if you're happy with your Q gut value already assigned, then you can just run it through with open padlock, and the back calculations will just take into account that value there. Okay, so the next part of the screen, let's move back to CLiv, is the predicted enzyme kinetics, and this is where you can input your in vivo FM, so typically based on clinical trial data, DDI interaction studies, or percentage hepatic metabolic clearance, which is probably more likely to come from in vitro studies of sort of reaction phenotyping approaches. And as you can see here, so there's a little bit of guidance before I go into this, just to ensure that you get the right values in. So you can see here that if you add rows, then you can find your enzymes in the drop down here. So in the retrograde, it's just for the CYP450s. So we only have the CYP enzymes available, and these can be selected. So you can select whatever enzymes you want. This phenotype column here is interesting in that if you want to run your reverse translation through utilizing only extensive metabolizer population data. So, for example, CYP3A4 will be run through via its extensive metabolizer enzyme abundances, which we have assigned in the simulator. Likewise, if you had 2C9 and EM only on, then that would be running through the extensive metabolizer enzyme abundances for that population that you've got set up in the RTT. Alternatively, if you want to consider it as a more balanced approach across all of the different phenotypes, then you can choose the SIM population. And for CYP2C9, we have phenotypes other than EMs in, so it'll give you an appraisal of the enzyme abundances when you run the back calculation through the retrograde approach across all of the different phenotypes. And you may want to utilize this approach if you have clinical data, for example, where you don't know whether the study population is phenotyped or not, and that perhaps is not given in a literature study, or in that case in which you haven't done any phenotyping in an in-house study, so you can be a bit more general there. So you can add some values in here. So let's just say 60%. 30%. There's a whole host of little error messages that come up if you violated any of the assumptions on this screen, or in the code if something's not quite right with some of the inputs. It will give you a warning, and you can then go and move through and try and improve your inputs. Or if you are not sure what's going on, then please get in touch with us. So I've given about 90% to specific pathways. My thinking here is once I click to predict that I should get some other pathway coming through, because 100% isn't assigned. So I'm thinking it should be coming through as an additional liver clearance. So it's backscaling through the microsomal protein per gram of liver rather than specific enzyme abundances as per the pathways given in the table. So what's happening here is when I click to predict, a background simulation is running of 1,000 people. And the reason why we do that is because we want to attain the most robust system parameters for running back through the retrograde, where there's no kind of biasing for log normal distributions or anything like that. And then you get the median system parameters being put into the code underneath. And so for 1,000 people, you may have a certain amount of CYP3A4 for this particular population with this age group and this proportion of females in, and it will return it. So once it's run through its gathering of all that median data for the system parameters, and then it's done the mathematical approach to reverse the well-stirred liver model and go through the reverse of the IVIVE, you'll get some solutions come up on screen. So we've got some solutions for intrinsic clearance per picomole of enzyme for both these pathways. And we have an additional clearance as well to top that up so we can get back to 100% metabolic clearance with some small removal of renal clearance here. A pop-up comes up and it asks you if you want to output. So you can do that, or you don't have to do that. And it should just give you a single sheet, and that provides the information on the system parameters that were derived from the 1,000 people population run in the background, and it will provide all of the necessary inputs and the values that came through once you'd got the solution. So there's some traceability there, and so that's probably good for kind of model workflow and understanding how things were done. So once you've done that, you can then click apply. And once you click apply, you should get some intrinsic clearances come through. That's not worked. Let's try again. I'm going to just reload this. Always happens with demos. Let's go back. Start again. Okay. So select your recombinant. Happy with whatever goes in there. 3A4, 2C9, population, 60, 30. So we can click to predict. And what should happen then is that you will get the prediction being applied back into the simulator. So while we watch that running through and hopefully apply it back in, I'll just quickly talk about the CLpo. So the CLpo option, if you click on this button here, will allow you to input any in vivo clearance data from oral trials. As I mentioned previously, the FA can come in here and the FG can be applied here if you know the FG. One of the things to think about with any FG input is if you've got any CYP3A4 running through, or 2C9, or any of the other major CYP enzymes that are found in the gut. If you believe that there's reasonably strong metabolism through there, then you probably don't want to have an FG of 1 here, because you're going to be considering that you have some metabolism occurring in the gut, even if you don't precisely know what that might be. So you can add a value in here that may not be 1, and then I'm not getting the IVIV coming through. Okay, I'll continue on with this, and yeah, essentially you'll get the CLpo being obtained from the intrinsic clearances first of all that you have in the liver. So you'll get the back calculation of the retrograde model through the liver system parameters, and then it will work out what it needs to do with respects to recovering your FA and your FG. So I'll come on to that in a minute in a slide. But what I wanted to just quickly show you is that if you run your simulation with the application of any of those system parameters, then one thing to consider is you need to match your trial data, as I've said. And then when you go and check your intrinsic clearances or your FMs, please check the purple sheets. So you need to output the steady state sheets first of all, just to do a double check, and hopefully you'll recover your intrinsic in vivo clearance rather, which I think in this file was around about 3.7, 3.8. So we've done that in this given population. Our FMs seem to be coming back reasonably. We have some renal component as well that needed to be factored in that you didn't necessarily know about when you added in the data into the RTT. So the renal component is also stripped out, and we have a small component of the additional metabolic clearance which came through the RTT. Okay. So in terms of the CLpo, as I mentioned, you can play around with the QGUT parameter value. So this can either be run through in simulation, and this will alter based on your FA that you've got assigned, or you can fix it if you're happy with your QGUT, and the resulting solutions will come through. So I'm just going to migrate just very quickly. I don't want to go through this in any great detail, but because this is recorded, you will be able to view this again and see what happens. So the reverse translation through an FA user input is thus, and this is through the first order absorption model. So you have the FA user being back calculated through KA to the PEF-man. PEF-man can then be converted to the CLperm via the adjustment factors to then comprise the QGUT model, which we talk about in the workshop, so the CLperm and the villus blood flow. So when you have the FA user input and your padlock is closed, this is what's happening, and you can return a QGUT value. This QGUT value then matches the FA user input, and is the most appropriate value to employ going through the IV-IVE. You can see here the QGUT and the FUGUT values are part of the FG algebraic approach we have in the first order model. If you rearrange that to isolate out the blink gut total, which is what we want to try and get some handle on, then you can do this here, and this is the reversal here, the rearrangement rather, or the reversal of that. And then what happens here is that if you've got an FG that you want to return, and a CLpo obviously that you want to return, then the simulator can do one of two things. If it needs to add metabolism in, then it'll scale up through the picomole, the activities per picomole of the enzymes that were derived from the liver, and then scale it through the gut abundance of those. And if there's more gut metabolism that's required to capture FG, it will add in intrinsic clearance in the human intestinal microsomes. If there's too much metabolism going through based on the solutions provided per picomole of enzyme, then it will take drug away from the metabolic machinery and start reducing FUGUT from a value of 1 down until it gets you back your FG. So essentially that's what's happening if you run your CLpo. Remember, it's just a pragmatic approach. It's just trying to get you back what you put in. It'll find the best way to do that for you. So if you go on and want to run the IV-IVE, then typically you want to run it through the user input FA, because that's where the data is coming from. So you need to go to the user input rather than the predicted and run it through to get the best possible values in terms of where you've started from with the reverse translation to where you're going back through within the IV-IVE. There is one option that allows you to utilize a PEF-man. So if you run an IV-IVE, an RTT with the CLpo and you output, you'll notice, if I find the right one, here at the bottom, there's a PEF-man value. So if you wanted to use the PEF-man value, then you can utilize that and put it into the PEF-man box and use a slightly different approach in terms of recovering your FA going through the forward translation. Okay, so let's go back to here. So I'll just touch on the iterative approach. So this incorporates both the SIPs and UGTs. It utilizes a different method in the background. And so what we have here are essentially forward scaling algorithms rather than reverse scaling algorithms. So you naturally put your in vivo clearance inputs, your FMs or percentage hepatic metabolic clearances. You can select your CYPs or UGTs in a similar way to that which I showed you for the retrograde model. Just need to go and find the right enzymes and populate the data in the table there. But what happens here is there's complexity with the UGTs that makes it difficult to solve just using a retrograde approach. So you've got UGTs in both the liver and the kidney for many of the isoforms. And so to reverse translate through the retrograde approach was very, very challenging to isolate the different contributions of those. So we chose a forward scaling approach utilizing essentially similar algorithms to optimize the parameters that you've got running through. So similar to the parameter estimation module that you have running in the simulator, it'll start off with an initial estimate for your intrinsic clearance per picomole of enzyme. It will then run through an optimization procedure to give you an objective function. So the objective function then compares essentially the inputs to what you get in the outputs in that iteration. If it's not satisfied, then it will find a different initial estimate, it will run through it, and it will go on through that cycle. And then it will return your solutions once an objective function is found that's less than 1% difference from those input on the screen. So essentially that's the way that the iterative model works. Some key aspects of the iterative model are that we adopt a similar approach to the CLpo option within the iterative as the retrograde. So if you've got iterative on and CLpo, what will happen here with the liver system parameters in the iterative, it will find the solutions first per picomole of the CYPs or UGTs, and then if they're expressed in the intestine, it will then utilize the same backscaling approach as I showed in the previous slide through FA, FG to then get you back a reasonable approximation of what's occurring in the gut in the forward scaling approach. So a lot of the technical details that I can't cover in this short presentation are covered in the release webinar, so please go and review that. I just want to finalise on a common problem that we often get in some queries to the customer support team. So if, for example, you're applying a plasma CLiv into the RTT, and it's reasonably high, it's close to the hepatic blood flow. If your BP is less than 1, then there is the potential for the blood-related clearance to exceed the hepatic blood flow. So if your CLiv is 90 litres per hour and your BP is 0.55, then what happens is the CLiv is divided by the BP to convert it into the blood. Then that exceeds the typical hepatic blood flow for this population, and you'll get a warning message. So that's just something to consider as one of the common themes that we see with customer support and this tool. Okay, so I'm going to conclude there. We're pretty much on 4 o'clock UK time. I'm happy to take any questions if we have any time left.
Yeah, we run a little bit. So we can open the floor for the questions. Matt, you already got 4 of them. So the first one is, what would be the recommended approach in using RTT for drugs having concentration-dependent BP or FU?
Yeah, okay. So at the moment, we just have the option for the fixed BP side of things. So I suppose if you're working at steady state, then this particular program, remember, it is pragmatic. It works in steady state approximations. So if you're working with any time-based approaches, then you need to just be very cautious about what your steady state might be, and your BP in steady state. So really the retrograde approach will only give you back what's going to occur in steady state. Anything in time-based simulation mode, you will need to kind of factor that in through the IVIV of your ODEs. So yeah, just that the retrograde is simple and shouldn't be complicated more than is absolutely necessary.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. No, that's fine.
And the second one is about how does CIMSIP predict FU gut?
So through the retrograde approach, the FU, I'm assuming we're focusing on the retrograde approach. Yeah, if you're, I'll answer that question for the retrograde. Okay. So if you're assigning an FG into the reverse translational tool, and the model is effectively giving you too much metabolism back through the gut components, then the model will then basically use an algebraic approach to fit back down the FU gut to an appropriate level that recovers your FG in the retrograde. So that's essentially all it's doing. It's just taking your FG and going, what do I need to get my FG back by taking drug away, utilizing the FU gut. If it's in terms of what's occurring on the absorption screen, it's via the Rogers and Rowland method 2. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, and the next one is, can we use the tool to calculate using different liver model, the dispersion or the parallel tube model?
No, it's limited to the well-stirred liver model, which is the default that we utilize.
Okay, and the next one is about the local sensitivity analysis, whether there is a capability to run a local sensitivity analysis on the percentage hepatic clearance, metabolic clearance.
You can open up the sensitivity analysis if you're running if you've got an inhibitor on, you can open up the sensitivity analysis wizard, and there's an FMFE sheet on there which allows you to essentially optimize your clearance parameters for a given enzyme to recover your FE. It's quite another pragmatic approach of doing it, but you can do that if you have an inhibitor on.
Yeah, and just add to that, we have one topic which is planned to run for this technical webinar is to optimize the FM. So maybe that one, if it turned out one, I could answer your questions for that. But sensitivity analysis on the retrograde screen is not. No. Okay, I think we have another one there is about receiving some messages when you run the RTT. So I just read this through, but I guess to answer your question, really, the best way probably just send us your workspace and then we could have a close look on that. Okay, so the question was, so they received this message that the iterative method has failed to find a solution. Please check the input feasible, and it seems in their data the clearance is not exceed blood flow, and is asking whether if there are any other reasons for them to receiving this message.
So it's not exceeding blood flow, did you say?
No.
Again, we need to have a look at the way that the model was put together. Typically you'll receive that message when the iterative model can't find a solution based on your outputs. It can't get to within that 1% tolerance level that I mentioned previously on this slide. For one reason or another, we would need to dissect out the inputs for that and work out what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's the last question we got from the chat box, and I haven't seen anyone raise their hands. I'm sorry, we ran a bit over time, and if Maddie can move to the next slide, the last
yes,
one.
Of course.
Thank you. And so first, I will give a big thank you to Matt for demonstrating the reverse translation tool and share his notes with us. I hope you all find this talk engaging and informative, and also to everyone who joined us today, and thank you for your active participation. Should you have any additional questions later on, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Our next technical webinar is on the 12th of October. We will discuss cross-trial parameter estimation, presenting by Dr. Tan Von. Once again, thank you for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you on the 12th of October, and have a wonderful day, and goodbye. Thank you all.